All right, should be good to go.
All right. Well, if all is working well, we are now streaming live on Facebook Live. My name is State Senator Robert Martwick here on the 10th District Northwest side of the city of Chicago. And I'm welcoming you to all of you on Facebook Live to our community discussion about policing and the issues of police reform and improving police relationships. So happy to have everyone here today. And we have a wonderful panel, and we're going to have a discussion, and we're going to talk about it. I want to begin by thanking my co-hosts. Joining us is Representative Lindsay LaPointe, and Nord Park Township Fire Trustee Frank Avino Jr. is here. So the three of us are the hosts here. Before we begin, a big thanks to a couple of volunteers who were sort of the motivating force behind this coming. Jacob Kaplan, Dave Feller, and Ed Bannon, who have been helpful to myself and Frank and Lindsay throughout all of our policy work. Were the ones who really brought up the idea of us hosting this discussion and trying to, provide some information and help people understand these issues. So let me begin by just saying that as we embark on this discussion, I think it's so important that we confront these issues and we have these discussions right now. We're all aware that there are a number of very high profile incidents that have led to calls for a reform. And look, in government, we should always be seeking to reform. Every corner, every nook, every cranny of government, we should be seeking to make better. That is our responsibility. And there are calls now that are not just local, and they're not just nationwide, they're international calls for changes to the way that we police communities. And as a result of that, here in Illinois, there will be legislation that will be brought forth before the General Assembly that will discuss, that will address this topic. And so in order to, as legislators, in order for myself and Representative LaPointe to be better informed, it's important that we have these discussions so that we understand those issues. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 8 years in the General Assembly, that everything that we do has a good and a bad. And everything we do is going to change things, and there will be good things that we hope will come out of it, and there will be consequences that come out that could potentially be negative. And understanding those issues, understanding the potential consequences of our actions, understanding the needs that we wouldn't normally identify with, are things that we need to understand so that we can make an informed vote. The reason that we're doing this discussion live instead of in a conference room or just a private Zoom conference is that I personally, and I think Lindsay agrees with me, Representative LaPointe agrees with me, that it's important that, especially on this topic, that everyone is involved, that our constituencies are informed and knowledgeable about these changes, because these changes will affect everyone in our society, and people need to know what these issues mean, what these proposed changes entail, and whether or not they support them or not support them, so that they can work with us and we can make decisions that best represent our constituencies. That's my hope here today. As I've been one to say throughout this, the calls for police reform are calls that is something that I must listen and learn about. And the reasons is that I personally, this probably is not going to shock anybody by saying I have never once had a negative interaction with a police officer. And I understand that is, for some people that is normal, and for some people that is not normal. But as we look to address problems in communities of color, as we look to address overall how we do these sorts of things, these are not things that are going to come to me naturally. I'm also not a police officer, so I don't know what police officers deal with on a daily basis when they go about their jobs. So before I make those decisions, before I make those votes that will change policy that affects both police officers and the people that they serve in our communities and across our state, I am very excited about having this conversation so I can learn and listen and be better informed. So with that, I'm going to start running through here. I want to do some quick introductions, but let's begin with My first co-host, Representative Lindsay LaPointe.
Thank you, Senator. As the Senator said, I'm Lindsay LaPointe. I'm the state representative of the 19th House District, which is the far northwest side of Chicago and a few of the suburbs, including Norridge and Harwood Heights. I'm especially thankful for this opportunity to listen, learn, and talk a little bit about this critical issue of police reform. Thank you to everyone who has joined us in our virtual audience today. And thanks to Senator Martwick and to Trustee Francavino. Just a little bit about my background. I've been a state rep for about a year. And before I was a state rep, I was a social worker for about 9 years. And then I worked for 7 years in the field of criminal justice reform policy, which can mean a lot of things. But the best way to put it is, it means that I worked to make our criminal justice system more rehabilitative instead of just punishment. And I see a more rehabilitative criminal justice system as better for public safety outcomes, better for human outcomes, and definitely better for taxpayer outcomes. Today, as the representative, I rep a district here on the far northwest side that has a lot of current and retired Chicago police officers and suburban law enforcement. And so in my year and just living in this community beyond that, I've had so many conversations with current and retired officers about how they feel in this moment, which in general is not very supported, ill-equipped oftentimes to deal with a host of issues that they confront on the street, and frustrated. And I've walked away from those conversations feeling like we have to do better. Also, as a rep, I represent a whole lot of people who are very concerned right now, sad, angry about systemic racism, about changes that we need in policing, and about how those two things intersect. And I share a lot of those points of view, and I walk away from those emails and those conversations feeling like we have to do better. I live in Chicago, in Portage Park, and this is kind of a useful point of framing. Chicago is a city that obviously has severe financial problems, and yet in 2018, we spent $113 million on police misconduct settlements, and every year we blow the budget for police misconduct settlements. So we're going to get into a lot of that, but as I look at police reform issues, as I listen to current and retired officers in my district and just other residents, my big takeaway as a rep, as a neighbor is, and I'm also, as Martwick said, we have the power to make some legislative change here. My big takeaway is that the current system works for nobody. It doesn't work for law enforcement right now or historically, and it certainly doesn't work for our communities that have the highest levels of violence and the highest levels of poverty, and certainly not for the taxpayers. So I'm very thankful to be having this conversation. I thank the panelists so much. I'm excited, and I'm going to turn it over to Trustee Avino.
Thank you, Representative LaPointe. Thank you, Senator Martwick. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to everybody watching live. Again, my name is Trustee Francavino. I represent the Norwood Park Fire Protection District as a trustee. I have been now for the last 4 years. Before that, I spent 3 years as a police commissioner in the village of Norridge. I'm very proud of the service to this community. We're a very proud community. You know, our first responders are there, you know, when we need them, when our neighbors are at their worst. We value that. We understand that that the tax dollars that we pay, you know, go to that funding, and we're appreciative of that. And but we're also living in a time where, you know, there is calls around the world, and we want to make sure that we're number one listeners, and that's what we're doing here today. That's why I'm excited to be here today. Alongside some friends of mine. I mean, Rob and Lindsay, you know, they get involved here locally. Rob grew up here in the village of Norridge, lived here for, I think, 46 years, Rob, if I'm not mistaken. So this community I know is important to him. I know it's important to Lindsay. Gotten involved a lot, and the policing that is done both here and in around the Chicagoland area, and obviously for the state as well, because it's going to affect what they do down in Springfield is going to, make a difference. We want to make sure we get it right. And these panelists, obviously they represent different viewpoints of policing. And, if we're going to be serious about doing this, we have to hear from different viewpoints. Anybody who, would just blurt out and say that it doesn't matter, they want to defund police. We don't want any of that. We want to make sure that we are listeners and we get this right, because it's going to be important, the decisions we make. There's a lot of officers out there who put their lives on the line for us every single day. And, we owe it to them. There's a lot of citizens out there that may or may not trust what the police do or trust what elected officials do. So we need to make sure that we are getting that point across, that we are here to listen and that we're here to get things done and make things better, as when Senator Martwick opened up earlier, that we are constantly progressing and making things better. So I'm very confident that we can do that. I look forward to listening to what the panelists have to say. And thank you again to everybody on Facebook Live for tuning in. I'm going to turn it back over to Rob.
Mute myself here. Sorry, I don't mute myself there. I got to remember to do that. Thank you, Frank, and thanks, Lindsay, for co-hosting this. And I want to say I'm really grateful for our panel. Thank you, panel, for joining us, because to me, this is always the best way to go about it, is to have both sides represented so we can have a frank and honest and thoughtful discussion about these issues and hear all sides of it. And I'm going to run through the list very quickly before I'll give everybody an opportunity to tell us a little bit about themselves in greater detail. But the four panels that we have with us today, we have Karen, and I believe it's Sheely. Is that right, Karen? Karen Sheely from the ACLU. We have John Milner joining us, who is a former chief of police for Elmhurst, I believe the longest serving chief of police in the history of Elmhurst, works with the Police Chiefs Association and served as a former state senator. Saeed Richardson, who, I'm sorry, I changed my thing here. You were formerly with the Community Renewal Society, but I know that you've moved on to a new thing. You'll tell us all about it. I edited my notes and I printed up the old one, so I apologize.
No
when
problem.
you have your moment, you'll tell us about your background. I know that you have done a lot of work in this space. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dean Angelo Sr. joining us, the former president of the Chicago FOP Lodge 7. I would say, and this was something when I was looking for panelists, as people in the field of policing said, and I think, Dean, you'll take this as a compliment, a cop's cop. So someone who has dedicated his life to law enforcement, and certainly having been the president of the FOP, is very familiar with the policing side of these issues. What a great panel. I think it's going to be a great discussion. Just a brief introduction from everybody. Let's start with Karen. Karen Sheely from the ACLU.
Thank you. My name is Karen Sheely. I am the director of the Police Practices Project at the ACLU of Illinois. I represent clients and cases regarding police misconduct and also work on policy work. Saeed was formerly at Community Renewal Society and was our point of contact in our litigation, where we represent community groups who have the right to enforce the consent decree over the Chicago Police Department. We're also litigating questions around stop and frisk. We have a long-term agreement on that with the city of Chicago, and have challenged the use of force by a number of departments in the west part of Illinois against a young swimmer named Jalen Butler. So we work on use of force, stop and frisk. We regularly report on racial disparities in traffic stops, and I'm very pleased to be here today to be part of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Karen. Now I'm going to turn it over to my friend John Milner, former chief of police of Elmhurst. John. Oh, you're muted, John. Let me unmute you here. Unmute. There you go.
Got it. Thanks. Glad to be here. Glad to join everybody. And I have to say that
I'm not sure there's two sides. I think we should be all in this together. And I think that as we look toward police reform, we can't say no, we're not going to have police reform, because there certainly needs to be some changes to be made. But I truly believe we have to work as a team. Look, so when I was a police officer in Elmhurst, I rose through the ranks. I did all these things. And again, longest serving chief, but I trained police officers all over the country. And I trained them in this thing called, meaningful, creating positive connections with other human beings, right? And that would work for all things, such as interviews and interrogations, being able to get a suspect to talk to you about what they did in an intimate setting, and doing it in a way that develops rapport, and so people will talk to you. And that also works for victims, witnesses. It works for people who are upset in their communities. It works very well with community groups. And I train police everywhere doing that. And currently, I still train the new police chiefs around the state of Illinois. I work for the Western Illinois University's Executive Institute. After being the chief, I was a term and a half as a state rep, Lindsay, and I enjoyed the House a lot, actually. And then I kind of moved to the Senate, and kind of like you, Rob, and the Senate's a little bit different. We can talk about that sometime too, than the House. And I enjoyed my time there. I spent time in the House in the Criminal Law Committee, and the same in the Senate Criminal Law Committee, and I was a spokesman both times. So I learned a lot from a lot of people. But truly, I believe we have to work together on this particular issue. There's so much to learn. There's so much to do. We might not agree on everything, but I truly believe too that one side might be here, the other side could be over here, and we have to find those common denominators and grow from that.
Thank you, John. Look forward to your participation in this. I'm going to turn over to Saeed now, and Saeed, you'll fill us in on your background since I had the wrong notes.
That's all right. Sure. And thank you very much to be here. Saeed Richardson. I have the honor and joy of being the Programs and Operations Officer for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We are an organization that primarily focuses around equipping, encouraging, engaging, and building capacity for African-American clergy, African-American churches, and African-American communities to do work that ranges from community service to advocacy to policy change to really making a difference in the community and the world around them. I also have the honor of having previously been the Director of Policy at the Community Renewal Society, where I have the joy of having worked with the wonderful Karen Sheely at the ACLU and the former BPI project manager, Lindsay LaPointe, over in her days past as well. I'm also a pastor. I've pastored on the south side of Chicago for a number of years. I'm currently now pastoring at the First Baptist Church in Waukegan, which is a little Chicago, particularly where I am. And I come at this issue of police accountability, one, because I am African-American. And although we'd like to, see ourselves in a different state in the world today, I am not alone in saying that I am still, I feel a whole lot of ways when I see a police officer. I've got a daughter who is 16, who's a phenomenal water polo player. She is a strong African-American female with broad shoulders and muscles. And I worry when she's outside and how she might be engaged when she approaches police, particularly the age where she's beginning to drive. Not yet, but she'll be there. And a son who's 11 years old who internalizes everything that he sees on the news all around him as well. And also for the communities that I serve too. And so this is a problem that's not new. I'm glad that we are having it. I'm glad we're at the forefront. I'm glad we're having this conversation. But at the end of the day, my heart and my soul is that we see not that conversation is the best thing, but we eventually have to move towards action that's sustainable and that persists long beyond any of us here on the screen.
Thank you, Saeed. And finally, we'll turn it over to our final panelist, Dean Angelo, former president of Chicago FOP, someone who I had the pleasure of working with in my time in Springfield. His entire term was while I was in the House, and we worked on a number of bits of legislation together. Dean, thank you for joining us. Oh, let me unmute you here, Dean. Here we go. There you go.
Are we good?
We're good.
Okay. How is everyone doing this evening? I'm glad I was invited. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this. We are in a situation right now. I know it was mentioned about how police feel about the times that we're living in, but it's not just the police, it's their entire family that feels a bit on the outs, to say the least, about what's going on. The amount of police ambushes that have occurred, since this unrest took place or began, is off the charts, both on duty and off duty, slaying of officers. There is so many parts of this moving train that's already left the tracks right now, that I think it's very critical. Discussion is one thing, but actions, I think, are much more called for. My big concern, and I think a lot of police officers' big concerns, come along the line of who is going to be suggesting changes. How are these changes going to impact their workday, or increase their threat of violence and safety? About the ultimate goal for a policeman is to get home at the end of their shift. And there's so much about this field that people believe they know because it's all over, or it used to be all over the tubes, all over the TV set, from the CSIs to the cop shows to the families, the one from New York and all these different TV shows. People get very comfortable with the field itself because they've been so overexposed to it, and they think they know what the police do based on these, movies and television shows, and it's completely different. It goes from 90% monotony and more or less boredom to sheer terror, and that terror comes over you in a matter of a couple of heartbeats. And that's what I think a lot of people miss in this picture as we move forward with changes. Are these changes going to adversely impact, the safety of these officers that are out there?
Well, thank you, Dean, and thank you all your panelists for joining us. Thank you for those introductions. And let me begin this discussion by going back to what Representative LaPointe said, and I think which is echoed by John Milner, the sense that things are not really working for anybody, right? What we know about, of course, the most public stuff that we know about are the negative interactions that people have been having with police officers. But as Lindsay said, as we walk around and we talk to police officers in our district, and in our district we represent a lot of them, we realize that many of them are having very, very difficult challenges. To just, one of the things is that what a lot of people don't realize is there is not just a local, but a statewide shortage of police officers. We can't hire police officers. It's very difficult to hire them and retain them. And then once they're there, the challenges of the job that they're doing is wearing on them too. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that we see increasing suicide rates amongst police officers, higher and higher, it seems, every year. And I don't have the stats, but I know that it's something that I've read recently that we're, police officers are having a very difficult job. So as Representative LaPointe said, it seems like this system isn't working, and we need to make it work better for everyone, the people being policed and the people doing the job as police officers. And so, and as John said, we have to come together. There has to be one solution that we all work on together. So let me start out with this. This is about reform, and in the most basic sense, and I really mean this, and maybe we'll start with Saeed on this. What does it mean, right? What are we looking to do here when we hear these different calls for reform? What does police reform mean to you? Oh, hold on, Saeed. We got to get you on
okay.
mute.
I got
There
you.
go. All right.
In a very real, pragmatic, and simply elementary way of understanding it, it literally means to reform the way that we have done and we see policing. I think it's critical for us to understand that policing is not just a couple year or a couple decades long formation. For policing is in itself the way it reflects the history of our country. We think back to the roots of policing and how they relate to racism, and how they relate to controlling of slaves and people who were crossing and going places where folks didn't want them to go. And we think about the fact that the early policing systems that we had very little training and very little structure to them. And that things have been basically sent throughout the years that have been embedded into the very DNA of not just the police, but to the culture itself. That's what we're dealing with. And the reason why it's so hard is because we're trying to deal with an over a century long problem. We're trying to deal with it as if it's just something that's been going on for the last couple of years. And so at its core, it requires us to literally rethink from the bottom up how we see policing should and need to be done. And it's challenging. It's challenging. It's difficult. It's hard work. It's work that takes a long time. It's work that requires us, particularly those who hold the power and hold the authority and hold the badge, to lay down and to really be about recognizing that even systemically, the things that they have been taught, the way in which they engage, the way they think before they even put on their uniform, ultimately impacts how they do policing. It's hard, long, and it's difficult work.
Dean, let me turn back to you, Dean, because
Sure.
we you know, there are many, as I said, there are a lot of calls for reform, and I think there's going to be a lot of legislation proposed. As the perspective of someone who once represented the rank and file police officers of the city of Chicago for 3 years as their president, as you see these discussions around police reform start, as the guy whose job it was to care for those officers, what are your concerns? Like, what do you see from the police perspective about calls for reform, where you say we need to be, where can we make the lives of, or the jobs of, police officers easier with our reform measures, as we, to go back to what Representative LaPointe said, so that the reform process not just makes the outcomes of policing better, but makes the job that police officers have to do something that isn't as difficult as it is and as trying as it is for them right now when we talk to them.
Well,
where does reform? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's changed so much in my career. I did 37 and a half years. My dad had 37. He came on in the 50s. My son's got 15. My daughter's got 4. I've taught in the academic setting over 3,000, 4,000 police officers nearly, to assist them getting their formal degrees, whether it's undergrad or graduate degree. My dissertation was on police training. I broke down every course of curriculum that the Illinois Training Board offers or mandates throughout the state. So I've studied this. I've got some sort of expertise on the training components, how they're implemented, how they're glanced over, and where we've advanced in training from the days of here's your badge, here's your gun, your call box key, go to work. Now you're in the academy for 6 full months, 40 hours plus a week. And then you're on probation for another 12 months until you can demonstrate that you meet the criteria that the department sets as standards and acceptance to cut it more or less to become a fully sworn member of the department. That being said, the municipalities hire these individuals that we have on our forces. We've got good and bad in every career of our society. So we have people that have had psychological background exams, criminal background exams, drug exams, put them through physical training, put them through all these courses that they have to successfully pass exams related to those courses. And these are people from all walks of life, African Americans, Hispanics, Caucasians, kids from the city, kids from suburbs, people from, from different countries come here to be the Chicago police. The big concern the officers have, and what I have as a father now of police officers, is that the changes that are coming, because just like the body cameras, they were coming. The changes that are being discussed here are coming. Our concern as officers and family members of officers is who is putting forward those changes. How familiar are they with this field? Because when you have individuals that may be elected, and not going to pick on elected officials, by any means, because they are our life source, in this field, and have always been. We've always had a pretty decent relationship with a lot of our electeds. But we also have electeds out there that refuse to do ride-alongs, that refuse to do civilian academies, that have been in office for, more than, several terms, and have never sat in the back seat or alongside a member of a police agency throughout the state for a full tour of duty to see what they experience. They've never gone to the academies to be put in those shoot, don't shoot situations, or to get into a mock scenario where you are literally fighting for your life. And when you have the ability to give someone a lawful order, to come to you, to identify themselves, to stop, the behaviors that they're involved in, and that individual pushes back or tells you they don't have to, or if you're taking them into custody and they struggle and fight or maybe try to disarm you, you don't wait for someone to get your weapon out of your holster before you decide to put hands on individuals. These life-threatening situations are so critical to some of the policy changes that I see coming down the road or being discussed about coming down the road, that many people in our society have never been in a fight in their life. They never got hit in the face. They never had that athletic contest where they were, they used to call it, hey, get your bell rung. Today they call it a third grade concussion, but when you are engaged in this job and an individual does not want to go back to the penitentiary and will do what he needs to do to avoid that, this is a fight for your life. And the restrictions that people are looking to put on officers as far as dealing with those situations, I think is what scares most members in the field and their loved ones. The administrative things, all the other stuff that the agencies have thrown on policemen. They have to be marriage counselors. They have to be mental health workers. They have to be keepers of the peace. They have to be, cognizant of your addictions or your behavioral issues or your life issues at home. In a matter of seconds, you're asking for people to walk on water. And I think there was only one person that did that. He's no longer around. And I think what they're doing in the context of where we're at is asking a really, really lot of today's police officers. Some trained better than others, and then expect them to be perfect. When they err, and everyone makes an error, people can put them either in prison or their heads for a mistake. Discipline is designed to be a behavioral adjustment, not to lose your livelihood or wind up in jail for doing something that used to be acceptable last week, but because of a change in climate and perception of what police should and shouldn't be doing, people that don't know what the police do are making it unlawful to be the police in some situations.
So it's right. So like, for example, what Dean's saying is right. I think the big thing.
There?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you hear us,
Everything's
Dean?
kind of frozen on my end. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's- pick it
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
So it's kind of a lack of understanding, right? Most people don't understand what the police do. As an example, Elmhurst, a nice community in DuPage County, here's Little Peace and Cook. But in that community, we handle over 50,000 calls for service a year. No, nobody knows that. And the calls for service will range from anything, any possibility. So, you know, when someone calls the police at 3 a.m. because they're scared because someone's trying to break into their door, their house, or they're hearing suspicious noises, or there's domestic disturbance next door, you know, the police have to respond. They have to be able to call 911, and someone has got to respond to that call. And most people don't realize how many calls there are like that. And I know they're talking about having social workers respond to domestic violence calls. I would bet money that if they were a social worker, they wouldn't want to do that. But if they did, because they're new, they wouldn't do it very long. I think they would stop, because you don't know what you're going to get into with domestic violence. You can get there and it's a simple call. It's a matter of just having a conversation with both parties, or as soon as you walk and ring that doorbell, a fist comes out that window, or even a gunshot. You don't know. And when they call, sometimes it's a simple call like, well, you know, we have a little problem here. My neighbors are having some kind of an argument. I think everything's fine. And when you get there, it's not fine. It's a family fight with everybody literally rolling around the floor, punching each other and throwing things and breaking things. I mean, you don't know till you get there. And again, most people don't understand this. And so I represent the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police as their lobbyist. I also represent ILEAS, which is 950 law enforcement agencies around the state, in addition to a wide variety of other clients. But I'm telling you, looking at some of the legislation people propose, I get it. I know why they're doing it, but in practicality, it's very, very difficult to implement. And this is something why we have to work together. There has to be communication so you can see why this could work or might not work, and some of the things we could move forward. Yeah. I lost you, Rob. I don't, you still there? There you are. I got you.
I apologize. Yes, I lost on one and I joined back on another. I hope everyone can still see me and hear me. I'm back. Sorry about that. The joys of modern technology, right?
We're all still here though, right?
Yeah, we are all.
If I can chime in right here.
Yeah, please.
I'm just thinking back to Dean's comments about how a lot of folks don't know what police do. You know, police have to be social workers, they have to be caseworkers, they have to be marriage interventionists. They've got to know how to de-escalate situations. And then there was a comment that we know one guy who could do that walk on water. In many ways, what you just described is the fact, you know, is what a pastor's job is. I do exactly the same thing. I show up, I'm a marriage counselor, I'm an interventionist, I'm a social worker. And then I show up places where there is violence as well. And I don't know what's on the other side of the door too. And I say all that because at the end of the day, Senator, you asked the question about making the police's job easier. And I want to argue that it should not be easier. I want to argue that it's by design. It should be a difficult job. There should be a lot of thought and energy that goes into assessing a situation, making, even in the sense of making a decision on the dime. I think back to my days, my short term in the military and the Army, and I think about how my commanding officer really forced me to think about what it meant to have to pull the trigger and to take the life of somebody who was on the other end of my M16. And they never let us walk and exist without knowing that there's a severity to making a decision when you have this weapon, this firearm in your hand. And at the end of the day, I think when it comes to being a police officer, the reason that you have that really long, 6-month academy experience, that you're on probation from there, the reason that you have all that training, and it should be a consistent training that never stops, is because there's a lot that's required of you, and it needs not be easy. It needs to be the kind of thing where you are constantly having to do that work. And I say that as somebody who is, I had short term in the military. My father was a military police officer as well. And I've just sort of, everything that we're seeing nowadays, it's not the, everything that's coming across the news. It's not that we're seeing police who are having to make troubled decisions and are sort of working outside of their bounds. We're seeing people who are, if anything, not taking those decisions serious enough. And we're seeing it over and over and over again. And so when it comes to things measures like body cams and things of that nature that we're trying to put into place to sort of enforce and to reinforce accountability. It's because we're recognizing that the severity of that job and that duty, at least from the public opinion, at least from what we see in videos and media, it says over and over again that it's not being taken serious enough.
Can I jump in and support kind of what part of what Saeed said, and then maybe push it a little bit further, say that this is an incredibly important job, and there's so much that's put on police officers. And I think that we're at a moment where a lot of people are asking us to think about what's the scope of what we're asking. And we've defunded schools, we've defunded mental health care, and the burdens that result in people's lives, we're basically asking the police to clean it up. And I think that we're at a point where we may be able to find points of agreement around the fact that putting money and resources into ensuring that people who need it can get mental health care, that we could divert people from the criminal legal system into getting better resources from social workers and support from wraparound services so that they don't result in the next 911 call instead of, there are people who, will interact with the CPD dozens of times. And if we could instead divert some of these people to get the resources that have been drained in other areas so that there isn't a police interaction where an officer has to make a hard decision, I would rather see that happen. I would rather see a world where people get more support and are pulled away from the criminal legal system and into supported healthcare instead. I think there are other instances of this too, where, if we need to think about what it is we're asking officers to do on a daily basis.
Karen, you're absolutely correct. I mean, you're absolutely correct. And here's something to think about in terms of reform I think we could agree on. They assign police officers to schools and for a wide variety of reasons in different parts of the state, right? But one of the things that most law enforcement officers will tell you they don't want to be is a disciplinarian. So now they're in a school and now they're expected to discipline some child. That's not their job. The school, the people in the school should do that, but all of a sudden that discipline situation leads to some kind of a fight or whatever it may be. Police officers shouldn't be involved in that at all. And then the other little comment I'd like to make is that years ago, they asked me as the police chief what would it look like to cut the police budget by 10%? And I worked hard on that. And what I had to cut back then there used to be this thing called the DARE program, and in our community worked very well. Anyway, I'd have to cut that. I'd have to cut all school crossing guards. I'd have to cut the traffic unit. I'd have to cut training for police. I'd have to close the police station, and et cetera, et cetera. And doing all of those things didn't even get me to 10%, because you still need that officer to respond to emergency calls. You can't take them away from the street. And so again, this defunding issue it's the devil's in the details how we accomplish that. But I absolutely agree with you. And then one more point, back in the 70s, yes, I'm an old guy. When I was a police officer, we used to have these mental hospitals that you could actually have people referred to. Now we use the county jails. And it's just unacceptable. We have people that have mental issues that don't need to go to jail, but they're going to jail and they need help, and we need support in the system. And I bet from Chicago police officers to officers around the state, and in fact, the country would like that additional support, would like the social worker support, would like for us to be able to send somebody someplace that would be helpful to them. It's just that we just don't have that option in most cases. Some cases, but in most cases, we don't.
Rob,
John, yeah, well, I was just going to say, you guys bring up very, very good points there. And Lindsay, I think you've probably heard this too. When we walk around and talk to people and we happen to run into police officers at the door, I hear that often about, and I think the most common one that comes up, John, you referred to it, Karen, you referred to it, is the fact that we have disinvested in mental health services. Obviously, very famously, Mayor Emanuel, when he came in, faced with his first budget crisis, closed half the mental health centers in the city of Chicago. And of course, I've talked to police commanders who have said, it's a real problem. It's this circle someone calls and there is someone creating a problem, and a citizen calls and says, this person is creating a problem, whatever that problem may be, and they want the police to solve that problem. And so the police arrive on the scene, they take that person into custody, they try to get them some sort of mental health, but there's nothing there. That person gets taken to a hospital. Hospitals are not designed to really treat long-term for mental health problems. So they release that person. That person goes right back to where they started from. And within hours or days, the police are getting another call to pick up the same person for the same problem. And it's this circular sort of problem. I've heard that over the course of the last 8 years, at least a dozen times talking to police officers. And so, and this is where I want to, because this is great, because we're just naturally getting into the topics that I had written down on my agenda to talk about. So let me ask this, and Saeed or Karen can start here, and then I'd like to hear what Dean and John have to say. But there are many calls for defunding the police. And now people have asked me, what does that mean? And I say, well, I don't know for sure, which is why I'm looking forward to hearing you, but I think it means a lot of things. I mean, I think there is no doubt that there are some people that are saying, and we've heard it, that we don't need police officers. I will personally tell you, I disagree with them. I think we do need police officers. I think it's an important part of our society. But if that's the case, what do they mean by defunding the police? What are the range of options that involve defunding the police? What does that look like, so that people understand when those calls come, if there is some sort of legislation that talks about defunding police officers? I mean, in Minnesota, did they not? Was it Minnesota where they disbanded their police department and then reconstituted it? Was it Minnesota? But anyway, I'll turn it over to Karen and maybe Saeed, and then I would love to hear from Dean and John on this as well.
I think this is a great question. So in my mind, the way I kind of think about it is that there's a spectrum. And on one end, there's calls for reform, where there are people who want to have more restraints on police officers, who are looking for more accountability, better training, tools that help try to improve community relationships with the police. And that kind of imagines the world and the status quo right now. And then there's a range from there all the way to complete abolition of the police department. And with that one, it asks you not to imagine the world right now, but to picture a world where there's much less crime, where there are fewer situations that require a police response, and then trying to build to get to that world. And part of that is the concept that for a lot of people, what they experience when they interact with police officers is an experience of violence. And I think that has to be named. There are people who have, I've got a client who was misidentified. He was pushed to the ground. He was misidentified as somebody who was violent. He was pushed to the ground. He's a swimmer on a swim team. He was the only Black kid on this team. He's coming back, he's a college athlete coming back from a swim meet, and was off the bus for 10 minutes because his coach asked him to take a picture showing where they were coming back from the meet, and just over the border from Iowa. And he was misidentified, pushed to the ground. He was completely compliant. A knee was put on his back and kept there, much in the way that is the kind of restricted breathing that you hear about on a day-to-day basis. And what we've been hearing about in the news over and over again. And he was told that he was going to have his head blown off if he moved again, and a gun was put to his head. And from the officer's perspective, they were trying to find a violent person where they were coming from. From my client's perspective, he was completely traumatized, didn't feel like he is himself in his shoes anymore. The other students on the bus were traumatized. The bus driver, who was a veteran, was traumatized. And that moment changed his life in a way that he's not going to come back from. So when we talk about that, like, how do we solve that problem where there was a misidentification and there was an overuse of force, and somebody's life was changed because of it. We can reform. We can try to change police training. We can change the rules around policing. And then there's the scale of what do we do to try to address the underlying causes of crime, the other underlying causes of what we're calling for with police intervention, and funding those measures instead of just funding police as a measure and winding down. And there are also people who would say to you, I'm not the person to be able to probably tell you this message the best way. They would say, do that today. Like tomorrow, let's flip the switch. But I think what you're going to hear when you're calling for in Springfield is let's start thinking about what it means to need less of a police response for things like mental health crisis. What does it look like then to have a different response that may be better both for the police officer and for the person who's being responded to? What does it look like to try to address crime by providing resources to a community instead of calling for another 400 officers who could do crime suppression in that community? And those are the things, that's the kind of dialogue that people want to start imagining, because that incident with my client where there was excessive force, there was it shouldn't have happened under normal rules. It could be solved maybe by the reform efforts, but we've tried that over and over again. And what people are asking for is let's try to reimagine whether every response needs a police response, or if we can reinvest in communities, support people through other means. And the next time we see a spike in violence, are there other things that we can do to try to help address it so that we're not creating more instances where there are opportunities for that kind of police violence? And that's, I think, the framing that people are coming to this with that's different than what's been done before. And it may make some people uncomfortable, but I think that it's a dialogue that we need to have. Wade, how does it strike you?
Yes, is the bottom line. I think there's another piece to the defunding argument as well. It's worth bringing up. When I was 13 years old, we were living in Charleston, South Carolina. And I remember going one Tuesday evening to the building that I always went to for our Boy Scout meeting. I had my 10-speed bike, didn't really quite realize why all the lights in the building were off outside. And I get there, and then the first thing I hear as I pull up to the front of the building is, get off the bike or I'm gonna blow your effing head away. And then what I didn't know was that there was a bomb threat exercise or drill that was going on, and they weren't sure whether it was a drill, whether it was real. And the next thing I know, I've got 6 police officers pointing M16s at me. And this is a 13-year-old. And granted, I've been able to move much through that, but every once in a while, even as a 46-year-old man, that image comes vividly to my mind. And I think to myself, what if I had not gotten off my bike? What would they have done? And so a very real part of the defunding argument is also recognizing that our police have turned from a civilian patrol force into a military operation. When I see armored personnel vehicles, when I see police wearing combat gear that we would see over in Iran and Iraq, I think to myself, like, how can I even begin to have a conversation about moving into peace and having a situation de-escalated when the appearance of having a fully armored soldier, coming up against me and my flesh, blood, and shirt, it just doesn't match up. And so I think another significant part of the defunding reality is demilitarizing the police and letting it look from at first glance like it's a force that's meant to help and protect and to serve, rather than one that's meant to defend, offend, and encapsulate people in a very militaristic presence.
Dean, how would you respond to that? I mean, let's, you know, that there's been many news stories about how, you know, we had the federal government pushed military surplus, basically giving it to police departments. And Said talks about this militarization of the police. And I've read many articles about how we need to demilitarize our police, and as Said said, make them more of a community sort of operation. But then again, if I try to put myself in the shoes of a police officer who might be policing a dangerous neighborhood where there's gang activity and automatic weapons, they might feel like, hey, I need to protect myself. I need the tools to do my job. What's in your mind, you know, where is the balance there? What does the police officer think? I mean, I have to assume, you know, Said's point is well taken. Right. What seems to be missing is police officers having that relationship with the people that they police, so that there's a level of trust and understanding and cooperation, right? Like, and again, as someone who's not in the middle of this, that's what I see, is there's this lack of sort of relationships and cooperation. Is demilitarizing the answer? Is it making the police more community friendly? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's, you know, two issues related to that. Fiery, one is, you know, the militarization and the equipment that's was being supplied by the federal government. When you are going up against people that have those fully automatic weapons, you need to be able to respond with light weapons or stronger weapons, you know, and when you get into these rural communities, or even in our city, there were 15 shell casings behind a notorious restaurant at Harlem and Higgins a couple of weekends ago from a shootout, you know, and are you supposed to bring a 6-shooter to that event if it kicks off and you're around the corner? Because sometimes you're right around the corner when you hear those rounds go, but you're not pulling up with your riot gear or your military type of vehicle. You know, you're there in your blue shirt with your bulletproof vest and your sidearm. There are times when you need to protect yourself gear-wise. So when you look like one of the Ninja Turtles from head to toe, and you're all, you know, protected with chest protectors and shin guards and face masks and elbow pads, that's because you've got people dropping off pallets of bricks at corners throughout these demonstration routes to be tossed at the police. If you don't have people in protective gear, you're going to wind up losing more and more officers to the ER and or you know, worse. So I imagine there's an argument for both, but if you don't have the equipment, you can't take advantage of the protection of that equipment. And if you don't have the, for lack of a better word, firepower to match someone that's barricaded with either explosives or automatic weapons, then you are losing that certain situation, and you're placing the rest of the community at risk. So you have to have things ready if in fact you need them. The other part with the relationship with the community, you know, I worked in gang crimes for over 15 years in worst parts of our city, when we had over 930 some murders in the mid-90s. We had a pretty decent relationship with the law-abiding people in those communities all the time, because they wanted that nonsense in their neighborhood to stop. And the only way they could do that was by participating with us, calling us, but they certainly didn't want us sitting on the front porch or knocking on their front door in uniform to let the rest of the neighborhood know that they're communicating with the police, because now they're, you know, an open target for some retribution down the road, which is another reason why we have such a low clear-up rate in our city on murders, because people are, you know, fearful for cooperating. Some people might blame the association with the police and the mistrust with the police. I've personally experienced that people do not want to participate in the court system because they do not want to be firebombed at 3 in the morning, or they do not want their kids subjected to a beating or threats on the street because their aunt or their grandmother or their parents are witnesses in court against a very active either group or individual related to that group. So there is that fear that that is real in some of our more violent communities, and no one seems to want to talk or get into those living rooms and sit with those families that don't let their kids out at night, or now even during the day. You know, it's in the backyard. They don't put the kids on the front porch because they're afraid of what else is outside. The big heat wave that we had in Chicago, people had their windows nailed shut at a point where they were afraid about people coming in their apartment. They were too concerned about their safety to go outside. And literally, I remember one of the MEs in the news broadcast said that people are literally cooking themselves to death because they're afraid to come out of their home in some communities for fear of what's waiting for them outside. Now, was that fear real or actual? But, you know, perception is everything. We've got to get a hold of these bodies that are being dropped in our city on a regular basis. And it's off the charts right now with these young kids or these young offenders that don't have, you know, their biggest concern is about what they're going to do later on this evening. They don't look down the road for next week or next year or for a career. You know, they don't think their life expectancy is such a long runway to begin with in some of our more violent areas of the city. And that's a shame to grow up like that. But does that become a police issue? You know, we've had over 3 million calls for service, between 2.5 to 3 million calls per service in Chicago and on an annual basis on average. And we don't have events like they had in Minnesota. You know, we've got some very good police officers that are out there doing a really good job. We've had 50 years of lack of investment in the areas that were devastated after Dr. King's assassination. I did a presentation at the City Club several years ago where I pointed that out. You know, these communities have been electing representatives to city council and downstate and in Washington, and the parking lots that used to be residences have been that way for 4 generations. Their kids are walking through the empty vacants that their grandparents walked through, you know, after the riots and destruction that occurred. And no one has reinvested in over 50 years. But it becomes a police issue to address, you know, the poverty and the downswing of the socioeconomic opportunities that are, you know, all over these areas. But, you know, people have got to become responsible to the people they represent, and to the people in the communities that they work in, as far as police officers do. On a regular basis, these young kids are out there, they're meeting and greeting, they're talking, they're walking, they're talking to people in the neighborhood. But it's that headline from states away, because it's as if officers were involved in that situation. And
you're getting a little bit of
it turns into everybody's painted with the same brush.
Yeah.
Dean,
You know, you bring up
Go
a
ahead.
good point. Let me just jump in for 1 second here, guys. And the reason I want to jump in is I want to take just a little bit of a pause. I want to invite Representative LaPointe and Trustee Avino to get in on this discussion as well. And I also want to just make sure that we're aware, we have some topics that we really need to cover in terms of information. And I just want to run through the sort of the list so we can make sure we get them in our discussion. We've covered a lot, which is great. But I would really like to talk a little bit about, and I think Karen, you might be good on this, GAPA and CPAC, what they are, what these proposals are, what the difference is. What is this sort of community policing and civilian oversight. What does that mean? And I want to hear the police perspective on this as well, because I know that there is some differences of opinion there, and I think that's something we should talk about. I also want to talk about the Attorney General has come up with the idea of licensing police officers. I don't know that it's his idea, but it's his proposal to license police officers, and I'd like to talk about that as well. But before we turn it over, and I'm going to be a little bit more quiet, let the Representative LaPointe get in here, and I know Saeed, you're waiting to jump in too. I want to echo something that I think is being said here by everybody. And it's a point that I've made for a long time since I've been in the General Assembly, is that if you want to know what most of our problems are caused by, it's caused by our inability to sort of rein in our financial problems, right? Because as a government, we cure problems that we can identify by spending money on them, really. I mean, and Dean, you talked about the fact that we have a lack of investment in communities, a lack of opportunities, so much so that we've created sort of a generational cycle of people that feel that they have a sense of despair, or that there is no opportunity for them. Saeed, you kind of mentioned that as well a little bit. I would also say that, when you look at some of the problems that we're having with policing, one of the things that I believe from talking to my constituents, Lindsay, I'd chime in here because you've talked to a lot of police officers as well, is it's the same thing. We are understaffed as a police department in the city of Chicago. We had a model that relied on a lot of overtime, and who's not going to take overtime? Who makes enough money that they're like, I don't need any more, right? And instead, what we do is we overwork our police officers in situations that they shouldn't have. We talk about the mental health thing. So we put them on too many hours in situations that they're maybe not trained for or equipped to deal with. We have, in the efforts to reform our pension systems, we have diminished retirement benefits for police officers, which means the end of that career is not as secure as it might have been in the future. And so, we constantly make these changes because of our financial problems, and it's across the board, right? I mean, we cut back on DCFS, we cut back on mental health, we cut back on restorative justice, some of the areas that Lindsay worked for, constantly trying to find alternatives to sentencing. We could never fund it properly. Programs designed to prevent homelessness, wonderful programs that have tremendous outcomes. We disinvest in them. We've disinvested in education. And so there's no doubt that a lot of this comes back to our ability to solve our problems because we're unable to manage our finances. And that's just something, that's my 2 cents. I had to get that in there because I think we could all agree that if we could invest more money in training and for police officers and the proper numbers, so they didn't have to work themselves to death and put themselves in overstressed situations when they're not equipped to handle it. And if we had opportunities for people in disadvantaged neighborhoods and invested in those, providing economic opportunity, educational opportunity. And Karen, you talked about this, right? Defunding means reinvesting in the things that these communities need to reduce crime. We can't afford to do that. And so this is why, in case anyone's listening, if you want to know why I got so into government finance, this is it, because I think that all of our solutions can be solved if we can find the answers to our financial problems. So that's my 2 cents commercial about why I work on that end of things. But now I'm going to be a little bit more quiet and listen. But please, let's talk about GOPA and CPAC, because those are big issues. Let's talk about licensing. Lindsay, I'm going to turn it over to you, ask a few questions. Oh, we got to unmute you, Lindsay. Sorry.
I am, a bunch of the panelists have mentioned the relationship between the community and police, and I think it's appropriate when we talk about communities to think about the communities that are dealing with the highest levels of poverty, the highest levels of violence, and the highest levels of policing in those communities, and they're Black communities and Latino communities. Mm-hmm. And I won't talk too much about this, but I'm convinced, and I know some other people are too, that is so key to everything. I know it was mentioned it's mentioned in the consent decree, it's mentioned in the police accountability task force, and this kind of new, more recent wave of police reform that we're in. And To me, it seems very logical. There's no one cause of crime, of course, but that lack of trust and that lack of feeling comfortable bringing information about crimes to police just exacerbates crime and really leads to people taking justice into their own hands, because the police are hamstrung in solving crimes because this relationship between communities and police is so broken. And I know that these ideas for GAPA and CPAC kind of came out of those discussions. So I'm eager to hear more about that from Karen or Saeed.
Saeed, do you want to start? Because I know that you spent a lot of time working on GAPA. I can do it if you'd rather, but I think that you've got a better perspective on this one than I do in a lot of ways. You're also silenced.
I want to be honest with you. I'm at pause for answering that question. I'm gonna tell you why. There was and I should put it in context. I was a part of the GAPA coalition for about 3.5 years until I recently came to the position where I work at right now. And so I have a lot of love and respect for all the work that has gone into these measures, ultimately trying to get to a point where we recognize that even though the police may say that they know the best how to do their job, it's obvious that because of the problems that have been arising, that it's not working. And so I think that's sort of like a fundamental thing. The way policing has been happening, it's not working. I think it's also important, and I promise I'll get to a point in like 2 seconds, maybe 4, that we separate out 2 issues. There's the issue in terms of what happens in communities that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, where there may be violence, and that's definitely some of the things that Dean was saying. I say it as a parent who wouldn't let my son go out to the playground by himself because there have been shootings, and so that's one argument. But there's another argument, and that's how police engage holistically in all the rest of the spaces that they inhabit. And I think it's really important to separate those 2. The reason why I feel like the question is not appropriate is because that question sort of puts GAPA and CPAC at odds with each other, rather than really focusing on what the problem is. And that's that the police need a way in which they are held accountable to the communities that they serve. I was at a hearing once where it was supposed to have been 4 different entities coming together and talking about the problems that our city has, and it turned into a slugfest between GAPA and CPAC. GAPA and CPAC, ultimately, at the end of the day, they both want to see reform and change, radical reform and change within the police, and they want to see it done in such a way that there is a governing body that's led and fueled by community folks that have real power and authority to enact change around police policy. And so I think that at its core is a significant piece that we need to. So I'm nervous because when we start asking that question, we get the community swinging fists at each other instead of recognizing the problem is having civilian-based ways in which ensuring that the police are held accountable.
That was really well said. And the piece that I think that it's important with both of the proposed ordinances, and they kind of move over time, they look a little bit different over time, is the question of whether people feel like they have a way to get information about the department and make changes around policies that the department has. And to kind of give you a sense of that, like I'm going to use traffic stops sort of as an example. Why do we do traffic stops? What's the purpose of it? I think a lot of people think that a traffic stop is typically around a traffic safety issue. Somebody's driving too fast, somebody blew a stop sign. I do that on the semi-regular, I won't tell you where. And the goal is to make driving on the road more safe. But kind of over time, traffic stops have been one of the ways that the police department makes the decision that it's going to have a touch to a community member. And that's not a very nice touch. It doesn't feel good to get stopped by the police. It's a scary moment in a lot of people's lives. And even like I'm a nice white lady who does not think she's going to get shot at the end of it. I don't like a traffic stop. And the decision to use that as a moment to have a contact isn't a decision of an individual officer. It's a decision of a department that it's going to use its resources that way in order to try to find a gun in the car, try to find drugs in the car. And one of the things that happens that studies have consistently shown is that when you pull over Saeed Richardson, who does not have a gun or drugs in the car, for something that isn't a clear traffic violation that involves safety, you should get resentful. Because I do too. White people and Black people at the same rate get resentful when they're pulled over for something that's not a serious traffic violation, because they know that it's a pretext to try to have a conversation, get in your car, search your car, maybe do a consent search, ask permission to search your car. And it makes you feel like you're being suspected. And researchers have studied this. And part of what they found is that Black people are much more likely to be subject to those investigative searches, investigative stops that aren't related to traffic. And the reason I'm kind of going down this hole is that it's one of my favorite holes to go down, but it's also because this is not a decision by individual officers. This is a decision at the top that then comes down. And both of the proposals are trying to get some control over that. Like that decision that's made kind of internal within the department, it's a kind of bigger picture decision about how resources are going to be used. When do we get to ask anybody about that? Like I do if I sue the department, but normal people don't get to ask questions typically about why this is happening. Why is it that there are another 200,000 stops this year over last year in Chicago for traffic stops? Why are the racial disparities so big? And what people are trying to get is some kind of control so that they can ask those questions and dig into the policy questions and the decisions that the department's making so that we can have more informed debate and have more control over when the department is making decisions that impact people that they may not realize are having that impact. And I think that, you know, the community control, that the ability to call in the department and ask questions publicly and make changes to policy, the ability to help in the selection process of the new superintendent, the head of COPA, like having some control over those processes. It's partly because there's been a political failure where people don't have enough information or enough direct impact with the people who are in charge around an area that really affects their lives really often. And I'm very hopeful that these, maybe the two groups can come together and come to a solution where there's a single ordinance and get it passed. If either of the ordinances pass, I think that's part of what this is driving at, is that there are big picture policy decisions about, are we going to enforce low-level misdemeanors? Are we going to care if somebody has a little bit of marijuana? We've decided in Illinois no recently, but that was a decision that the police department and the state's attorney was making before. Are we going to care about open-air drinking? And is it worth it to have a police officer engage somebody who's doing it? Maybe in some situations, maybe not in others, but maybe like saying all the time we're going to do broken windows policing can lead to consequences that are really harmful for people. And I think that anytime that we get a chance to like open up those dialogues so that we see that it's not just a question about individual officers making decisions, it's a question of big picture decisions being made and then putting individual officers into the situation where they more likely or less likely have to make those hard decisions. That's the structure that we need to start having a dialogue around. And I think that the community control of police ordinances are an opportunity to do that, and it can be a really powerful tool.
So Karen, let me ask you this question.
Real quick.
Yeah, and John, let me interject and then I'll turn it over to you really quickly, because like this whole concept of right, GPAC and CPAC, or GAPA and CPAC, excuse me, I got to make sure I get my monikers correct here. It's about citizen accountability. So trying to create a system and some sort of board or group that would be made of civilians that would oversee the activities of the police. And so, yes, John, I want to hear if you think this is a good idea or not. And then my question would be, after you talk, or what I would like Karen to answer afterwards, or maybe Saeed, is, don't we have that? Isn't that the job of our aldermen in the city of Chicago to be the oversight of the police? We have COPA, we have I mean, we have different boards. We have the police board. We have a lot of different organizations that actually run the police. And so my question is when we do this, do we need to create more, or should we be looking to create one that works better, where everything's wrapped into one? You know, where we don't have all these different, too many cooks spoiling the soup, as it were. And again, I don't know the answers to these, but John, please, I'm going to turn it over to you. And then
So we're almost to 90 minutes, so I just want to make sure I get this out. One, the pastor, you said something about militarization, and I agree. We should not be an occupying army. If you're an occupying army, there is no trust. And that's what happens. They just don't trust the police. So what we have to do is have a balance. You still need that equipment, like Dean said. You still need the people to have these certain things, but there's a way to balance that out. But the other thing you said, Pastor, is the fact that policing is not working. And I will totally disagree with you on it. They handle millions and millions of calls every single day across this country, and it's working fine. People every day are writing letters about how the police saved their lives, saved their families, saved their community every day. I can't tell you how many calls I got like that from people. If it wasn't for the police doing what the police are doing, this would never happen. So to say policing is not working, I can't agree with that. However, there are things that we need to do to change, I believe, too. Regarding traffic stops, I would have to say that we do traffic stops for a reason. That's one of the biggest complaints the citizens have, is the way people drive, the way things happen. I mean, it's a huge complaint, and we have to respond to what our citizens want. But I'm a little passionate on this here, is because if we don't stop people that commit these violations, driving drunk or whatever they're doing, I've witnessed many deaths in my job. And due to lack of enforcement, letting people get off the hook, not doing what you should do. And the way to be able to bring that in line is traffic enforcement. If you have an area where people are doing 100 miles an hour on Route 83, you're going to have to enforce that to slow that down or to stop it. I mean, and that's one way of doing it. And then lastly, this thing about the person that you handled, Karen, that young man who had that terrible experience with the police. I mean, those things have to be addressed. Same thing with you, Pastor. You had that situation that you personally experienced when you were a young boy, where they're putting guns in your face. And I get that. But the other side of the coin is that we have to say here, before we disappear, is that many, many police officers face the same things every single day. In fact, many police officers have PTSD. They go home every day with anxiety attacks. They go home, they can't breathe. Their hearts are pounding. They wake up in the middle of the night with bad dreams. This is happening every single day because of encounters with people that are just, people that are not right, and they have to deal with that every single day. And we can never forget that. So again, this is something where I believe we have to work together to solve these problems. This conversation tonight was wonderful, I think, because this is how we start getting to the root of the problems. Unfortunately, it's almost 90 minutes and we're just kind of scratching the surface.
Yeah, John,
Truly.
Just before we get cut off, I want to say we should have a book club together, because I would love to hear what you think of Pulled Over by Charles Epp, which is the study about traffic stops. I agree. If I'm out there driving 100 miles an hour, pull me over, I deserve the ticket. This is about where officers said, there's a minor traffic violation, but I pulled the person over, and he ranked the ones where it was so minor that it really wasn't about a safety concern. So we should, if you read it, give me a call. I'd love to talk to you about it.
No, I'd love to talk to you too. That's excellent. Yeah, good stuff.
If I could jump in,
Please.
We've had this discussion, I think, Karen, before, about traffic stops and the way to address the violence that we have in our communities is through policing initially. It's never going to be the fix forever, but I remember when the ISR came down from Springfield and I was talking to people down there, I was informing members of the caucuses that this is going to wind up exploding in the communities that they represent because the stops are going to step back and drop in number. I think they went down 200,000 in the first couple of months after that was implemented in January of that year. And we saw an uptick in the violence. We saw an uptick in the murders and in our shootings. And we're seeing that again. When the department wants to address that gang retaliation or a pattern of violence that's occurring with shootings between neighborhoods or within the neighborhood, they have intelligence coming from these communities by people that are informing on what they hear or what they see or who they know is going to be involved or has been involved. That information gets to the department. Certain cars, certain vehicles, and stolen vehicles are used regularly to commit one of these violent acts, and they dump the car, run away. You've got someone's stolen vehicle, nobody around. In order to get that individual before he pulls the trigger, you need to do some targeting type of traffic stops. You look for members that you know are gang affiliated. We know, when I worked in gang crime for 15 years, I knew who these guys were. I knew their families, I knew their moms, I knew their younger siblings. So when we saw them in a car that wasn't theirs, and we knew that there was a shooting in their corner last week, they're looking to return the favor to somebody else, we would take them down to talk to see where they're going, who's with them, if there's any contraband on them. Absolutely. You look for this as a preventative measure, and this is directed by the department to address these issues that are occurring in our neighborhoods. Now, are there individuals that will get swept up into this? Absolutely. There are circumstances that have blown back on agencies because of this type of aggressive policing. But what do you do when you've lost a corner? And I remember telling this to our state's attorney a couple of years back. I said, when you lose the corner, you're going to lose your block. When you lose your block, you're going to lose your community. And before you know it, your community is going to be on fire, and the shootings and the bodies will be dropping all over the place. We're seeing that now. You've got to find a balance on how you address these guys, these kids riding either bikes or driving in cars that are armed with weapons, that are randomly firing into crowds or homes, and get them before they pull the trigger. These other issues on the reform and how you get in the community and you build that trust are all topics that are going to occur in Springfield and in different areas where legislation is passed. But in the meantime, what do you do to prevent that next child from catching a bullet? What do you do as a police department to try to prevent these murders from constantly? I mean, it's every weekend we're losing 20 people. We're having 60, 70 people shot.
Can I say that, can we reframe the question? Not what do we do as a police department, but what do we do as a city? Because there are other tools that we can also use, like violence interrupters, like other types of supports that need to be invested in, that we need to look to, because going back to the police over and over again has not worked. And it isn't an actual we can't arrest our way out of the situation.
No.
And I just want to do one little note that the ISR came about in January. The number of stops dropped by 80 to 90% after the release of the video that showed that there was a covered up of the murder of Laquan McDonald. So what caused what, we can debate all day, but that's the concern. And Saeed, I think I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I just have one simple litmus test, just in terms of the reality. One, the reality is that data says over and over and over again that the way in which particularly African-American people are engaging police is very, very different. It's very, very systemic, very, very systematic. And it's been going on for years and years and years. For me, the litmus test in terms of whether police is really working is whenever police do something that's egregiously wrong, that I would hear the FOP come back and say, I'm sorry. I have never heard a police officer ever say, I'm sorry. When something goes wrong, I hear immediately there's you're trying to vilify the person who was the victim. You're trying to find something that was wrong. I've never heard someone say, I'm sorry, whenever anything happens. To me, that's the litmus test. When somebody can look at me having done something wrong and can say, I'm sorry, and walk away from that, then I know that we have some measure of change. But whenever something goes wrong, we sat on this Zoom call for an hour and a half, and I've not heard anything about all the public, you said slayings of police officers, slayings of African Americans that we've seen in the news for the last 6 weeks. It has broken my heart that I just don't hear I'm sorry. And so I hear what you're saying, Jim, and I hear, forgive me, Milner, I hear what you're saying about people calling in and thanking the police. But when I look at people like me, when I look at people like my family, when I think of the millions of African Americans across this country in particular, we're not having that experience. And we just can't get someone to say that what we are experiencing is real. And so I'm sorry about it.
Well, I'm gonna and say that's a profound point, and I don't know if it's the best point to end it on, but I think we're exceeding our time here. And if I can say anything about this, is I think as Karen said, we are just scratching the surface here. There is so much more to talk about here, and you know, I want to sum up some of the things that I've heard here today, because again, this is a learning experience for me. But I think what I've heard are things that I've been hearing, which is that we are really just starting to peel back that first layer of the onion on, I mean, in this discussion on these problems, and you know, I think we're a long way from, you know, these solutions. It's clear from 90 minutes of discussion, these solutions are not going to be easy. There are challenges, and I think that we're going to need to see each other's sides and have more of these discussions if we're going to have the information that we need to make good decisions. This is going to be, this is going to be a difficult time to be making these decisions in the legislature. Lindsay, welcome to the legislature, Lindsay. But I'm grateful for everybody doing this, and I would like it to give everybody, like I said, it feels so incomplete, but nonetheless, we're out of time, and we will do this again for sure, because I think it was very productive to at least to get started. But clearly, everyone has a lot to say on these issues. But as we let everyone go here, something was brought up by Karen, and I'm going to ask anyone to join her in recommending a book, right? As I seek to learn about this issue, and I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat that because I didn't write it down, and I got my pen in hand now. I'm going to write this down. So we'll go in order here, the same we did. I'll start with Karen, and I'll just, you know, a quick summation of the end of our discussion as it was, and a recommendation on something Lindsay and I can read to give us a little bit better insight, something that you think will be important for us to help us learn about the decisions we're going to be faced with having to make.
There are so many important and really wonderful books out right now. I'll stick with the one that I said earlier because I think it helps really explain the problems of traffic stops in a way that kind of cuts at it and comes from a perspective of law enforcement too. It's called Pulled Over by Charles Epp. And
EPP?
EPP, you can cheat and just read the first introduction of each chapter. The idea.
Just don't tell Charles.
No.
Right. Did you say his name was Roger Epp?
Charles.
Charles. Okay. Hey, folks, I hate to do this to you. I hate to leave. Thank you, host Rob, Senator, great job. Lindsay, great job. And you, my panelists here, thank you. I mean, it was really good. And that thing about I'm sorry is a good one. I got to tell you, the whole deal. So good to see you again, Dean. And
Good to see you.
have a great night. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, John. Saeed?
I've got a book.
Oh, Dean?
My daughters were upset that I gave it to them to read because it opened their eyes and something they really weren't too aware of. But it's called The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker. It's speaks about victimology, and that gut feeling, that sixth sense that several of the people involved in the book had, but forced it down and wound up on the wrong end of a crime. But it's a pretty easy read, and if anyone's daughter, mom, wife, anybody that's just starting to get out into society on their own, it's a pretty good read.
The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker.
Right.
Thanks, Dean. Saeed, you got a book? Oh, you're muted.
In here.
Give me about 30 seconds. Go to somebody else, or am I the last one?
No. I mean,
Oh.
we're just wrapping up. Lindsay, any thoughts on this? Or
Yeah. There's a bunch, because I can be a nerd. But there's a book called American Summer, written by a journalist, Alex Kotlowitz, who's written a lot about inequality, and it's a snapshot of this high violence summer in Chicago in 2013, and it's a great read. It's not a policy prescription, but it is a slice of life, and it very much helped me understand why violence exists and why it's hard to stop it, and how people have a limited set of choices. So it's a great read. It's a quick read.
Good.
Oh, sorry. I am going to suggest it's a book by Robin DiAngelo and Michael Eric Dyson. It's a great bestseller. It's called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And I think particularly in light of everything that we're experiencing right now, racism is a conversation that we really have to bravely and boldly go into conversation with.
and Saeed, what was the name of the author on that one again?
Yeah, it's Robin DiAngelo and Michael Eric Dyson.
Robin DiAngelo and Michael Eric Dyson.
My mom is reading it with her church group, and they're really enjoying it.
Excellent. Frank, you got a book?
You know what, folks? I don't have one to suggest, but I just wanted to say a few things. I mean, this discussion has been amazing. Everybody, to what the chief said earlier, that we're one side here. I mean, we have to, I understand there's differences. I need to say if there's no differences in this country, but there are. But we have to start working more towards one. Hard. It's going to be long. Not happen in our lifetimes, but maybe in the future we can start acting as one American people. And it's going to be, there's a lot to get us there. But the chief took the words out of my mouth, and I was looking for an opportunity to say that the situations that happened to both Karen, your client, and Saeed would happen to you. I will simply say completely unacceptable. And those things happen, and they're unfortunate, but hoping that lawmakers such as Rob Lindsay and the thousands of lawmakers across this country can make laws, and that there can be a justice system that can enforce laws both against people who are actual criminals, and then people who are victims, whether they're victims from whoever, that the law keeps us equal, and that when you are wrong, you have your court, and that's where justice will be properly served. But I want to just end on saying something about earlier we were talking about what's going on now in this country. What happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis. Maybe to you, there's hope. And I'm going to tell you something that I've noticed. I have friends who are very, back the blue, support the blue. But I got to tell you, sir, I saw a lot of postings about how horrible that was. And when I saw that from these people, it gave me hope. that, hey, look, you know what? It's not just a us versus them or a thin blue line if you're on one side or the other. But that's what made me open up earlier by saying that working towards being one, and that whatever groups that are put together, to review the police, or like Rob said, elected officials for that matter, is to make sure that they're looking to work as one, and that maybe they say, hey, look, the purpose here is to make sure the police are accountable and to make sure that they are truly fighting crime. If these groups, GOPA, CPAC, women, are coming to the approach saying, hey, look, we want to make sure that the police are not targeting individuals because of the color of their skin. They're targeting individuals because of the crime that they are committing and that they're to protect us in our society. So again, I have hope. There are certain wrongs that people have experienced and I never have. So, I'm willing to be an active participant moving forward. Please feel free to reach out to me. Senator Marwick can pass along my information. I'm very passionate about this subject. My little sister is a police officer. She was a Chicago police officer, and now she's here in the burbs. I have two first cousins who are police officers. I have a ton of friends that I went to school with that are police officers. They want to fight crime, and I want to make sure that they have the support that they need, and we're doing so by not marginalizing anybody, and that we're getting ourselves closer to one and making sure that we're truly solving the problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. And, as we wrap up now, I want to bring this to a close. I want to say thank you again to everybody. I know there's so much more we could all say, but, I think we all bring up a very good point, is that what it means to reform is to, Said, I think you said it, reform, or maybe it was Karen, reform. The problem is that that's not always clear, cut and dry what the best path forward is. And sometimes we institute reforms that have consequences that hurt us down the line. And that's why these discussions are so important. It's why I like to engage in them and learn from them. I've always believed, I've always approached in my term in the General Assembly, is not just to look at the good that we can do, but to anticipate the negative consequences that might come about from your actions, because that's really what you need to consider both sides before you take those steps. And I think in this space, there are great ambitions. And I'm going to repeat again what Representative LaPointe said, because I thought it was really good. We really need to focus on making the concept of using policing and making policing better, so that policing works better for better outcomes for police officers, for the people that they are charged with serving and protecting, for our community as a whole, so that we can all benefit from this reform. And that will be no easy task. And I know that there will be a great deal of opinions on it. So I am grateful for the discussion. Thank you for learning. I would suggest a book, but it would probably be about pensions, and that would just be good if you wanted to fall asleep. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you all for your time. Thank you, everyone on Facebook who listened in. I hope that you all learned something. I certainly did. I look forward to engaging with each and every one of you about this topic. For the panelists to learn more as this topic comes to a head, and certainly with my constituents. Lindsay, any last thoughts before we check out?
Just that I'm very hopeful. I think we're having a more pointed conversation than we have in a long, long time about these issues, and I'm feeling hopeful about lasting and sustained change.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.
Yep. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.